Hi, it's Kim, and today I'm talking to you about lipids. So, we just talked about carbohydrates. This is the second of the four macromolecules we need to talk about. Remember that lipids don't follow this general pattern of monomers linking together to form polymers. There are no monomers of lipids, and there are no polymers of lipids. So, that's why on this table, lipids, you can see they don't follow this pattern of monomers and polymers. So there aren't any names specifically for monomers and polymers. What they do all have in common, though, is that they are all nonpolar or hydrophobic. And we learned this during the properties of water lecture when we talked about how water shapes nonpolar molecules. And we used phospholipids as our example. Remember, phospholipids actually have a head region that's polar, but the tails are nonpolar. And those tails are actually fatty acids. So fatty acid tails are what make that part of the phospholipid nonpolar. And fatty acids are one of the categories of lipids that we're going to talk about. So are phospholipids. I know we've already learned a little bit about phospholipids, but I'm going to talk to you in a little more detail today about phospholipids. So this is the list of lipids we're going to talk about: fatty acids and triglycerides, which are how fatty acids mostly exist in our body. Most fatty acids don't move around through our bloodstream just as separate fatty acids. They usually exist as triglycerides. We'll talk a little more about phospholipids. We'll talk about cholesterol, which is a lipid also, and all the cholesterol-based hormones. And then finally, waxes, we'll talk about just briefly because they are significant in some living organisms and they are in the category of lipids. So let's start with the fatty acids. And we're going to talk about two important types of fatty acids that exist in your body: saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. These are both important and they are both used to make phospholipids. So when you're putting phospholipids together to make cell membrane, you use both saturated and unsaturated fatty acids to do that. Let's look at the structural difference, but first, I want to point out the differences between lipids and carbohydrates in basic structure, because you do need to be able to visually recognize fatty acids or lipids just the same as you do carbohydrates. So just a quick reminder that the carbohydrates, and I'm just going to write carbs for short, the carbohydrates, the way you recognize those as being carbohydrates is first, they had a carbonyl group, which remember was the carbon double bonded to an oxygen. And then multiple hydroxyl groups. So those were the two ways that you recognized a carbohydrate. Lipids don't have a carbonyl group or multiple hydroxyl groups. So the chain part of the lipid is just carbon and hydrogen. And when you have a chain of just hydrogen and carbon, or carbon and hydrogen, oops, I didn't really mean for that to go over this far. So I'm just talking about this part, just the carbon and hydrogen part right here. This is called a hydrocarbon chain. You've seen that term a couple of times now. Hydrocarbon chain is just a chain of carbon and hydrogen. So you don't see any hydroxyl groups on that chain the way you would if this was a carbohydrate. Also, you have a different functional group right here. So this one really kind of looks like a combination of carbonyl and hydroxyl. And remember, it's called carboxyl. So this is a carboxyl group. It has the carbon double bonded to the oxygen, but then it has the OH also. Now you'll see this carboxyl group when we talk about proteins also, because amino acids also have a carboxyl group, but amino acids don't also have a hydrocarbon chain. So you really need both of those clues to tell you that you are looking at a lipid. So remember, fatty acids fall in the category of lipids on our list of macromolecules. This top one is called a saturated fatty acid for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to quickly erase what I've written. And let's look at why we call one of these a saturated fatty acid and one an unsaturated fatty acid. Let's start by just looking at the basic differences between these two categories of fatty acid. So when you look at this top one, you can see the molecule, the shape of it just goes straight across. We call that linear. This is a linear molecule versus this one has a bend in the chain or a kink in the chain. It's not linear. So that's one difference, just looking at the shape. The reason the bottom one has a bend in the chain is because of that double bond between those carbons right here. And unsaturated fatty acids have at least one double bond between carbons. If you compare that with the saturated fatty acid at the top, you can see that saturated fatty acid does not have any double bonds between carbons. It's all single bonds. So all single covalent bonds between carbons. Sorry, between wouldn't fit there. So that should say between carbons, but it wouldn't fit there. And that's what makes that linear, is the fact that it just has single bonds. That double bond is going to cause the molecule to bend on either side. It's a very rigid bond. Now let's get to why it's called saturated versus unsaturated. Remember that carbon has to share 4 pairs of electrons to complete its outer electron shell. And if we go to the saturated fatty acid at the top, let's just pick this carbon. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So every one of those carbons is sharing 4 pairs of electrons. They're all single covalent bonds. And you can see we could say that these carbons are completely saturated with hydrogen. They're holding as many hydrogens as they possibly can. They're saturated with hydrogen, saturated fatty acid. Now let's look at the carbons that are double bonded in the unsaturated fatty acid. Remember that a double bond counts as sharing 2 pairs of electrons. So here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4. That carbon is sharing 4 pairs of electrons. It cannot share electrons with another hydrogen. It doesn't have any electrons left. Okay, it's already sharing all 4 pairs. So you couldn't put another hydrogen here. Okay, that couldn't happen. There are no electrons to share. Same with this hydrogen over here. It's the only one because this carbon is double bonded. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 pairs of electrons. Because these carbons are not holding the maximum number of hydrogens possible, they're called unsaturated. They're not completely saturated with hydrogen. Also notice that those 2 hydrogens are on the same side of the double bond as each other. And remember that is called the cis configuration. Geometric isomers involve carbon double bonded to carbon. If it's on the same side, whatever's attached to those carbons is on the same side of the double bond, that is the cis isomer. And that's going to be significant when we talk about trans fats in a few minutes. The normal natural configuration of an unsaturated fatty acid is the cis configuration. It's the cis isomer. Okay, that's just the basic structural differences between saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. I want to show you this picture too. So this showed you the saturated fat, also called the saturated fatty acid. It's another name for it. And you can see it's very linear and This butter is shown here because we typically think of most saturated fats as being the animal fats, so meat, dairy. There are some vegetable fats, though, that are saturated, but for the most part, these are the animal fats, lard. Okay, versus unsaturated fatty acids, we typically think of these as being the oils because they are not liquid at room temperature. I'm sorry, they are liquid at room temperature. They aren't solid at room temperature. These are very linear molecules, linear, linear, linear. And so these can really pack tightly together. And that's why these tend to be more solid at room temperature. But when we're talking about the unsaturated fatty acid, these are liquid at room temperature, and that's why they're called the oils. The reason they're liquid is this bend in the chain doesn't allow them to clump together. So these tend to remain liquid at room temperature. So we usually think of these as being vegetable or plant-based oils. Anything that we call an oil really falls into this category. So fats are an important energy source. If you look at the amount of energy available in 1 gram of fat versus 1 gram of carbohydrate or protein, you can see that it's more than double, 9 instead of 4. That's pretty significant. If you eat too many carbs, they go to long-term storage. Okay, this is our storage form of energy. This was very important in our evolution. So starting about 2 million years ago, humans were hunters and gatherers. They didn't settle down in one area and grow crops and raise livestock. They had to wander the land and eat what they could find. And animal fats were a precious commodity. They were very hard to come by. Having fat storage in your body was important because then you could go a long period of time without eating. Remember that our short-term form of carb storage is glycogen. Remember, we store a certain amount of glycogen in the liver and a small amount in the skeletal muscles, and that can be broken back down into glucose when it's needed. But we don't keep a huge supply of that, right? We keep maybe 6 to 8 hour supply of that on hand. If you have fat storage, though, you could go a week without eating. You'd be very hungry. Okay, you would feel hungry, but you wouldn't die of starvation. If we had to have a constant supply of carbs and we didn't have this long-term energy storage, then we would have to be eating constantly. Humans store more fat than other primates because we were hunters and gatherers. We didn't just settle down with our troop in one location and stay there and use those food resources. We moved around. And so it was an evolutionary advantage to have this fat store. But we've learned that fats do a lot more than just provide us with energy storage. Fats have a lot of other important functions in the body. And this is just a short list of important functions that fatty acids have in your body. Fatty acids are incredibly important for developing children. Okay, they need a certain amount of fats in their diet for normal growth and development, especially for their nervous system, their brain, their immune system. We need that fat for insulation. So to conserve our body heat. Your joints and your sockets have a certain amount of fat. So your eye socket, for example, has a lot of fat behind it. Even if you were to lose a ton of weight, you would still have fat behind your eye socket because it's protective. We need fat to protect our organs. So you have a certain amount of fat cells surrounding your organs to cushion them. Obviously, for making cell membranes, remember all phospholipids require fatty acids. So we need a lot of fats for that. Think of how many cells you have in your body and how many phospholipids that must be. And you need fatty acids for every single one of those phospholipids. That's pretty crazy. We just said normal growth and development, obviously, require fat, as we just said. And then fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so you have to have fat to help you absorb those vitamins in the intestines. So A, D, E, and K, those are all fat soluble vitamins rather than water soluble vitamins. This is what your fat cells look like under the microscope. They're these, big, hollow, vacuous cells. You don't see a nucleus, you don't see organelles. It's really just storage of those fat molecules. So those fatty acids are just being stored in those cells. And you'll see that, throughout your muscles or surrounding your organs, again, various places throughout the body. We also know that these fat cells, as part of our adipose tissue, these adipose cells release a lot of different hormones. If you have an organ in the body that releases hormones, it's called endocrine. So endocrine organs, okay, sometimes they're glands, release hormones. And fat cells actually release hormones, several different hormones that are important. Okay, one of them is leptin. And we're learning more and more about the role of leptin in obesity. And that leptin is a signal to your brain for when you need to be hungry versus not be hungry. So your fat cells release this leptin to tell your brain, hey, you have a big enough fat store, you can stop eating. If you're not releasing enough leptin, then maybe you're going to keep eating even after you have a significant fat store. So we're learning more about that. But you can see this whole list of other things that leptin does. It does more than just regulate appetite. It activates immune cells, it regulates your blood pressure, your thyroid function, your glucose function, in terms of releasing more insulin or not releasing more insulin, your heart rate, your bone mass, different things are controlled by this hormone, and it's released by your fat cells. Again, there are other hormones released by your fat cells too, but that's just the one I'm talking about today. For the most part, fatty acids don't just exist free in your bloodstream. Okay, we transport fats in our body as triglycerides. So if you've ever had a physical and they've told you your triglyceride levels are high, then this is what it's referring to. So tri means 3, and glyceride is referring to the glycerol molecule that is part of this. So this is a glycerol molecule right here. And through dehydration reaction, so taking water, OH here, H here, removing that water, dehydration reaction, these fatty acids get linked to the glycerol. 3 fatty acids connected to a glycerol. That's a triglyceride. Again, this is how you transport fats through your bloodstream to carry out all these other important functions that fats have in your body. We have what are called essential fatty acids. If something's called essential, that means you must get it from your diet. Your body can't make those molecules. So you're going to see when we talk about proteins, we have essential amino acids. These are essential fatty acids. You have to have these for normal physiological function, and they must come from your diet. And I'm sure that you've heard the names of these before, omega-6 and omega-3. So omega-9 is non-essential. And what that means is we can make that from other fatty acids, so you don't have to get that from your diet. But the omega-6 and the omega-3 are essential. Again, this is not a nutrition class. I'm not going to go through the whole list of foods that give you these, but just know that these are a very, very important part of your diet, important for so many reasons. And we're learning more and more about the health effects of not eating enough essential fatty acids. You can see here, this is just a short list of what those essential fatty acids do. Normal brain functioning, normal nervous system functioning, production of important hormones, regulating your blood pressure, your blood viscosity, vasoconstriction, immune responses, inflammatory responses, cell membranes, really important to get a certain amount of healthy fats in your diet. So avocados, fish, all the different nuts. Different nuts have different types of essential fatty acids. So like if you only eat cashews, that's not good. You might want to mix in some walnuts or almonds or some other kinds of nuts too. So very, very important. What aren't important in your diet are trans fats. So back in the 50s and 60s, when humans first decided we're going to start mass producing a bunch of junk food, okay, we're going to start making cookies and crackers and cakes, and we want them to last a long time. We want them to have a longer shelf life. And we want peanut butter that looks all whipped up and pretty instead of separating into layers and having a shorter shelf life. So they've started manufacturing these fats that came from an unsaturated fatty acid. So what they did is they took an unsaturated fatty acid. And remember the cis configuration, this would be the normal natural version, the cis isomer. And what they did is they did a process called hydrogenation. And what they did is they forced this trans configuration, and this trans isomer of the unsaturated fatty acid is linear. It's linear like the saturated fatty acid was, but it has a longer shelf life. It's an artificial form of fat. Linear, solid at room temperature. It gave these packaged foods a certain taste that people really liked. And really, this is what kind of started the margarine generation and shortening. I know when I was little, my parents thought, well, they were told butter is bad for you. Butter is clogging your arteries. This new thing called margarine, you can eat it. It tastes kind of like butter. You can cook with it. You can bake with it. Same with this shortening, like Crisco was the big thing. Like you go buy the can of Crisco, and we use that for everything. And we now know that it is killing us. Okay. It's really bad. It's not natural. Remember, the body recognizes shapes. Your cells recognize shape. So shape is so important. Here's my famous quote: shape is key. We have evolved to be able to process saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. We do not have the ability to process the trans fats. Okay, so you don't use these trans fats to build phospholipids. You don't use these trans fats to build any structures or hormones or anything else in the body. All these do is clog your arteries and kill you. Very, very dangerous. So dangerous that at some point the FDA realized this isn't good. We need to basically make it illegal for food manufacturers to use trans fats. They had to give the food manufacturers a certain period of time because they realized, number one, decreased shelf life. Okay, you can't ship some Twinkies and only have them be good for a month, because by the time they get there, they're going to be spoiled. Huge loss of revenue, millions of dollars of product being thrown away due to that shelf life not being as long, but also the flavor was different and people were used to a certain flavor. So how are they going to account for that? Fast food restaurants, they would fry everything in trans fats because you could use that oil multiple times without having to throw it out. And that was good, right? If you can be McDonald's and fry those French fries, for 2 months with the same vat of oil versus having to change it out daily, that was a big deal. So, but they were so dangerous that the FDA said, we have to get rid of these. Now, it doesn't mean that they've completely disappeared, because if something says no trans fats on the label, it just means it's below a certain amount. So if you see anything that says partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated oils, that means it still has trans fat in it. So hydrogenated, partially hydrogenated oils, those are trans fats. And I'll tell you, Girl Scout cookies, I think maybe they changed that this past year, but they still had some partially hydrogenated fats. You'll even see nutrition bars. Like if you look at protein bars, it's surprising how many still have hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated fats. If you're buying something in a box or a package that's already made, you probably shouldn't be eating that. Okay, that's not food. You should be shopping the walls of the grocery store. You should be eating fruits, vegetables, whole grain products, meats, dairy, any of that stuff in the middle of the store, that's fake food. Okay, if it comes in a box already prepared for you, probably not something you should be eating. And this is one of the reasons. I posted a bunch of slides about trans fats, but really I've kind of told you everything that you need to know. So they were inexpensive, they lasted a long time, they gave a desirable taste and texture. They raise your bad cholesterol, lower your good cholesterol, increases your risk of developing heart disease and stroke. It's associated with a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So dangerous. So again, just because something says no trans fat, it means it has less than half of a gram of trans fat per serving. But remember, you can look at the serving size on a package. It's not the whole package, okay? Serving size could be 1 tablespoon. So if you have a half a gram per tablespoon and there's a big box, that's a lot of trans fat in one product. So really, again, look for partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated on the label when you're buying an already packaged product. Or here, my better advice to you is don't buy anything that's already made in a package. But again, some of us grab those protein bars or whatever, on the go. It's a good, quick, easy lunch. So really look at the labels on those. Okay, moving on from fatty acids, let's look now at the fatty acids that make up the phospholipids. So remember, these are phospholipids, make up all of our cell membranes. So the plasma membrane on the outside of the cell and all of the membranes within the cell, all the membranous organelles. So polar head, which is water-loving, hydrophobic tails, because those are fatty acids. Okay, just looking at the shape of those two tails, one is linear and one has a bend. Do you remember what those two types of fatty acid are called? Okay, so the linear one, no double bonds between the carbons. This is a double bond right here. See that with it's drawn? That's a double bond. And you can see that bend in the chain. So this would be the saturated fatty acid. Wow, I'm just really having a struggle with spelling today. Saturated. And this one is unsaturated. Okay, this is significant when you make a whole plasma membrane. So here's your cell. Okay, the whole outside, remember this is not flat. Your cell isn't flat like this. This is how we draw it on the board. But the whole outside of that cell is covered in the plasma membrane. That plasma membrane is regulating everything moving in and out of the cell. We're going to learn a lot about that. Everything moving in and out of the cell is regulated by that plasma membrane, which has some proteins that are regulating, but also these phospholipids are regulating what's moving in and out. Certain things can't move past those non-polar tails, for example. Because if something is polar, it can't just move across those non-polar tails. But also the shape of this is really critical because this bend in the unsaturated fatty acid, if that's in a membrane, it creates a space where certain molecules can slip through. And that plasma membrane, there's a term that we use associated with that. We say that it's selectively permeable. Okay, permeable means stuff can move through. Okay, it's not completely keeping molecules in or out, but it's selecting what can move through. And part of this selective permeability is based on the fact that some of the fatty acid tails on those phospholipids have this bend. They're the unsaturated fatty acids, and that bend allows a little space where certain molecules can move through. So an important part of that permeability is what ratio of saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids do we have? If there were only saturated, those phospholipids would all be really linear and they'd all come right up against each other like this, and there'd be no room for certain molecules to move through. It's when we have suddenly this one has a bend in the chain, and now we've got this little space where stuff can move through in and out of the cell. So this shows you a phospholipid bilayer, but in this picture, you can see that these are all linear. So these would all be saturated. Oh, goodness. Try this again. These would all be saturated fatty acids. You can see there's no space there. I'm going to take you to this picture and you can see, well, they didn't really show the bend very well, but this is showing you cholesterol. But if you can imagine that if some of these had a bend in the chain, it's going to create some spaces where stuff can move through versus all being linear. I really wish now that I had put a better picture there to show you that. So when we talk about the plasma membrane, we'll talk about this again. This is just kind of an introduction to this topic of saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. So you do use both of those to make your plasma membrane. You use both of those to make phospholipids. So that just goes to show you saturated fatty acids are an important part of your diet. So you need to get those somewhere because you need a certain number of saturated and you need a certain number of unsaturated fatty acids to make cell membrane. So membrane fluidity and selective permeability is influenced by the phospholipids. Okay, having one saturated and one unsaturated fatty acid tail creates just enough small gaps for some molecules to cross the bilayer without it being too permeable. What that's saying is imagine that they were all bent. Now you're going to have too many gaps because they can't pack in next to each other. Okay, you want to have some of them close to each other. So really having a combination of the two is really ideal. So you use both saturated and unsaturated to make your plasma membrane. Both are important in your diet. Okay, cholesterol. Cholesterol is another category of lipid. And cholesterol falls in the category of molecules called the steroids. So when you hear steroid, you think of guys with big muscles, right? But not all steroids are anabolic. So anabolic steroids, primarily testosterone, which is one of the hormones that are made from cholesterol. So steroids are these 4 carbon rings fused together. So 4 fused carbon rings. So they all look pretty similar to this. And this is cholesterol. Cholesterol gets a bad rap, but cholesterol is an important part of your diet because it is used to make hormones. And I'll give you a list of some of those hormones in a minute. And it's also part of the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is mostly phospholipids, but you're going to see that it also has cholesterol and it has some important proteins. And there are some other things going on there also. So here's more detail on the role of cholesterol in your cell. Okay, we consider it a stabilizer in the plasma membrane. Okay, so without cholesterol, the phospholipids in plasma membrane would move around too much. When we talk about the plasma membrane, you're going to see that those phospholipids are fluid. They move side to side, they flip-flop with each other, and they move around. Cholesterol stabilizes those phospholipids and keeps them from moving around too much. So this was the picture I showed you before. That cholesterol is a stabilizer in the plasma membrane. It keeps those phospholipids from being too fluid and moving around too much. Without that cholesterol, that plasma membrane would be too leaky because as those phospholipids are moving, molecules can slip through. Oops. And it's chemically modified into hormones. What hormones are we talking about? These are the hormones that are made from cholesterol. They're what we call the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones. Sorry, I need a sip of water. That's what's causing me to talk weird. Okay, so there's the list. Obviously, the first three we think of as being the sex hormones. And it's very interesting to see just those subtle differences. Estradiol, that's estrogen. You can see the shape of estrogen and testosterone are very similar. That's because they're both made from cholesterol. But just that subtle difference in shape, dramatic difference in effect, right? Estrogen causes completely different characteristics to develop than testosterone does. Cortisol, this is our stress hormone. It's meant to be a natural anti-inflammatory, but if it's present all the time, that's a problem. And we're learning more and more about the effects of having too much cortisol around for too long, because cortisol is produced in response to physical stress. So let's say you go for a long run and your joints and your muscles are sore, and cortisol is going to be released as a natural anti-inflammatory. It's the natural cortisone. So when you get cortisone shot to reduce inflammation, you're getting a synthetic version of cortisol. You know that you can't get a cortisone shot 50 times, right? It's really damaging to the tissue if you get too much of it. The same is true for natural cortisol. If it sticks around for too long and you get too much of it, it's actually very damaging. And in fact, I want to show you this slide. So cortisol is naturally made by your adrenal glands, okay, and it's made from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid. So cortisol is a lipid-based hormone. Your adrenal glands are on top of your kidneys, and cortisol does a lot of things, but really it's your stress hormone. It's supposed to reduce inflammation due to physical stress, but it's also produced in response to psychological stress. It controls your mood. It controls a lot of things, and it's really part of your body's fight or flight response. But we know cortisol can cause a lot of bad effects too, because it is used to manage how you use carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And we know that it controls your blood pressure. It can control your sleep and wake cycle. So when you have too much of it, it's bad. And this is just a short list. You can just read those for a second. This is just a short list of things that can happen when you have too much cortisol around. Back probably about maybe 8 years ago now, the Natural History Museum had a Body Worlds exhibit where they had all these preserved bodies you could go look at. And I was kind of leery about going. I'm not an anatomy teacher, and I'm still kind of squeamish about the cadavers. So I wasn't super excited to go, but I went with Dr. Carpenter, one of our most amazing teachers who just retired, sadly, for our students. And I just remember there was a display that showed two brains, one of a person who had been subjected to an enormous amount of psychological stress. And the brain looked like a raisin from the cortisol that had damaged that person's brain. Cortisol can be bad. You know, it was meant to be, it evolved to be a natural anti-inflammatory to reduce physical inflammation. But now with our current world, you know, we have a lot of psychological stress. And so we're constantly releasing cortisol. And I just think that as humans, the more we can just really put things in perspective and try to really relax ourselves and breathe and meditate and exercise and do things to really try to keep our cortisol production down, the more healthy we're going to be in general. And I mean, again, this is just a short list of things we know that happen based on having too much cortisol around. Okay, obviously the other hormones are sex hormones. And so again, you need a certain amount of cholesterol in your diet because these are all, these are all made from cholesterol, which is a lipid. So we would say that these are all lipid-based hormones, all of these, including cortisol that is now written over. I am so sorry. I am just like an old person trying to use technology here. Okay. These are all made from cholesterol. And so we would say that these are all lipid-based hormones, meaning they're made from lipids. Okay, because cholesterol is a lipid. Why am I telling you this? This is important because we also have hormones that are protein-based. Okay, so hormones can be proteins or they can be lipids. And the protein-based hormones that we've already talked about, two opposing hormones that we talked about with regulating our blood glucose levels, insulin and glucagon, are hormones, but they're made from protein. All of these hormones, these are lipid-based. They're made from lipids. What are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers. They're produced in one part of the body and they have an effect in another part of the body. So hormones are chemical messengers. They're usually produced by glands, but they're also produced by organs. And they're produced in one part of the body and they have an effect in another part of the body. So for example, insulin. Insulin is produced by the pancreas and it stimulates your cells outside the pancreas to take glucose into your cells. It also causes glucose to be linked together to form glycogen. So it's released into the bloodstream and it travels to somewhere else to have an effect. So these chemical messengers are usually released into the bloodstream. Okay, so estrogen produced by the ovaries doesn't stay in the ovaries, it gets released into the bloodstream and it has an effect on other organs in the body. So same thing for cortisol. Produced by the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, but released into the bloodstream and it has an effect throughout your whole body. Okay, finally, our last category of lipids are the waxes. And waxes are really significant in a lot of different organisms. So these are plant waxes and you can see the water beating up. Waxes are incredibly important in plants. So in plants, they prevent drying out, called desiccation, which means drying out. So waxes are really important in plants and waxes are lipids. This little cutie here, this frog, frogs and other amphibians use waxes to keep from drying out. So do a lot of different arthropods. So different, insects, crustaceans, etc. use waxes for the same thing to keep from drying out on land, and other functions of the waxes too. These guys actually have little wax glands on their back, and you can watch videos of them taking their back legs and moving the wax up over their whole body to keep them from drying out. In humans, obviously we only have earwax. And that wax is to protect your ear canal from things crawling in there, from other pathogens getting in, dust, dirt, debris, insects, worms, keeps them from getting into your ears. Okay, those are the lipids.